It is February 3rd, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. We're very glad you're here. My name is Wallace Smith, and I'm here with my co-host, Mr. John Robinson, across the table here in his pleasantly warm office. How are you, Mr. Robinson?
Doing well. Pleasantly warm is correct. In fact, for those keeping score at home, no jacket today.
No, we both have our ties on, but he is jacketless, and if you know, he's worn jackets in the past. So
if you sense a certain informality in this podcast, it's entirely because I didn't put my coat on.
You know, I don't know if I can't even think of a podcast I've worn a jacket on. I need to step up my podcast dress game.
I'm sure it comes through the microphone.
Okay, let's actually focus. And our topic today is an interesting one, and I know I've seen more than one request on this topic.
Yes.
Have you also, Mr. Robinson?
Yep.
Several of you out there, generally the younger side of our audience, has asked us to talk about the topic of having a crush on someone. And what do you do when suddenly you find yourself feeling like you have a crush on someone? So we're tackling it today.
Let's crush it.
Let's crush it. Welcome again to the Living Youth Podcast. It is great to have you here, and thank you to all of you who tend to write in here and there and suggest ideas and give us feedback, what we can do better, what we're doing well. We really do appreciate that. And again, the email for doing that is podcast@livingyouth.org. So hopefully everything sounds fine. It sounds fine in our headphones. Mr. Robinson is doing the Bible study here in Charlotte these days and had actually unplug some wires, etc., to move a microphone up. But it sounds great, Mr. Robinson. I think you got it.
I think if possible, when I reconnected everything, it was literally every plug was the opposite of what it should have been. Show prep took longer than usual today.
Yeah, but it looks like we're doing well now, and I appreciate it because I lift up virtually no finger. I plugged it into my computer, which is where we actually recorded it on my computer, and then he did all the rest. So thank you, Mr. Robinson, for your techie skills. All right, we are talking about the topic of crushes and how do you deal with one. And before we launch right into it, I want to say at least two things. One, a lot of this will seem like it's leaning towards our younger audience. Our audience, all of you wonderful people out there, are teens and young adults in the Living Church of God. And of course, a lot of you are listening to this with your families, which is wonderful. And we appreciate hearing from families as well. And this question has generally come in from younger people. And we want to say, if you're older, if you're a young adult, hopefully you are dating, seeking to date, the principles will still apply. Some of them won't apply in quite the same way, but I think you're going to see that there's principles that still apply across the board. But if sometimes it seems as though we're leaning towards our younger side of this audience, please keep that in mind. But the second thing, and this is kind of a mea culpa to a certain extent, I really need to apologize to Mr. Mark Sandor, who does listen to the podcast with his family, I think. Hasn't he told you that, Mr. Robinson?
Yes.
I think, and he's been on many times. So, Mr. Sandor, you might even be listening at this point, and you probably know where this apology is going. Mr. Sandor actually submitted to me, as the editor of the Living Church of God, a really nice article, draft of an article about dealing with crushes. He sent that. He sent some others, which we've already kind of edited and have prepped for release a little bit later. And, it first came in, and I looked at it, and I thought, I really need to spend more time with this. So I kind of put it off, but the putting off ended up being an unintentional, permanent kind of putting off. Like sometimes something falls so far off the burner, it's not even in the kitchen anymore. So it was sitting there, and it wasn't until we were actually planning on covering another topic today, and this morning realized, well, okay, we can't do that topic now, so let's do this topic. And then as I was actually driving in today, it hit me, hey, Mr. Sandor sent in that draft, and I actually had in my car it read it to me. I wasn't reading it in the car. I don't do that kind of thing, but I had the audio reading the article to me with Siri's robotic voice. Didn't sound like Mr. Sandor in any way at all. But I thought, that's right. Not only did he make some of the points that we want to make, he made a few I didn't even think of that would be good to make, which we do plan on incorporating here. So my apologies, Mr. Sandor, and I want to give him credit. Good. In fact, we will. I'll try to make up for this, and we will try to post that later.
Right. But also, if you don't like it, it's Mark Sandor's fault.
Oh, I really like the angle this is going. That's right. If you don't like what we're saying here, honestly, we're just saying what Mr. Sandor said. It's all him.
It's been a while, but I had somebody ask me one time. It's like, do you do the layout for the magazine? And I said, I don't know. Do you like it?
Okay, so those things said, let's jump right in. And we've tried to organize ourselves. Here we are 5 minutes in, and we're just kind of getting to the first point. But we thought right off the board, let's first start with the definition of a crush. What does it mean? You say, oh, I've got a crush on so-and-so, or she's got a crush on so-and-so, or he's my crush, whatever the case may be. But what does the word actually mean? Well, Merriam-Webster is the dictionary we tend to use for our publications here. It's a nice one. It's consistent. Everybody can access it. And Merriam-Webster defines a crush as an intense and usually passing infatuation. So if someone has a crush on someone, then the dictionary would say they have an intense and usually passing infatuation with someone. Sometimes the crush can be used actually as it's actually the object of the infatuation. So if a guy's got a crush on a girl, he'll say, oh, she's my crush, or something like that. Or if it's even someone on television or a movie star of some sort, then they would say, oh, that person is so-and-so's crush. But regardless, the key words there are intense, usually passing, and infatuation. And so we thought it'd be great to start off with getting the definition right out of the way.
I looked up, because I'd read about what the difference between infatuation and true love is. Not like a true love, but like actual love.
Yeah, something substantial, right?
And I know it's a little more technical, but calling a crush really a deep sense of infatuation is the right way to look at it, at least kind of biologically, if you will. And it really is it's like you immediately have this deep sense of a connection with somebody, which is actually technically impossible because you don't really know the person yet. So you feel like you have a really deep connection and you feel very strong feelings about it. And the thing is, it could be the beginning of love in the long term. I mean, you might actually like this person. It does turn into love.
It could turn into that or something in the future.
But one thing we might note right off the bat for those who have a crush, especially, let's say you're younger and more inexperienced, maybe it's even your first crush. It's important to understand a couple of differences between infatuation and love. And one of the things is the first thing is you feel a strong emotional feeling, that's quite pleasant, and you feel like you immediately have this connection with them that's almost like otherworldly, this kind of like almost like a love at first sight kind of concept, which allegedly is technically not true. There's not such a thing as love at first sight. It's just,
right.
What was it? There's a term for it.
Well, if you think about it, if it's at first sight, what does that mean?
It's literally actually a very strong attraction.
Right. Because if it's, they don't say love at first in-depth knowing. It's love at first sight, quote unquote, which really just means the image has bounced off your retina, right? You've seen the person. And yeah, that's not love. So it might be attraction, exactly, but it's not love.
Well, in my show prep notes, it says it's been studied, and the experts have found that love at first sight is not a distinct kind of love. In fact, it's a predictable outcome based on physical attraction.
Right.
So, it's interesting they note, because I think we would agree with this, Mr. Smith. True love takes time, awareness of who the person is and who you are, and that's kind of the point that I've taken my time getting to, which is real love. So one of the risks with infatuation is you tend to idealize the other person. Right. So the way you view them, you're not seeing the flaws and the potential problems down the road. All you see is just like really, it's your version of that person in a way. And that's very different than love, because true love, you do actually see the flaws and things, and you work through it and you love them anyway, despite all their flaws. I mean, Mrs. Robinson, to this day, she hasn't found a flaw with me yet. So, yeah.
I'll send her a list later, Mr. Robinson.
She's been listening to the podcast lately. But anyway, so that's an important thing to note. So when you have a crush, when you feel the strong sense of connection with a person, even if you don't emotionally want to grapple with this yet, at least the logical part of you should recognize that you don't really know this person yet.
Right.
And your version of them is probably not the actual version. And that just takes time.
Yeah, that's a great point. I looked up, and this fits with that. Based on the definition that Merriam-Webster gave about a crush, it mentioned also infatuation, right? So I looked that up, and do I still have that up? I think I do. Yes, it mentions in terms of what an infatuation is. It has to do with an unreasoning or even foolish attachment. That is, it's not based on actual reason. It's just something else, right? And it's not rational necessarily. It's not logical. It's not something you've reasoned through. You just feel obsessively strong about it. So it's very, very emotionally based. And as we'll get to, emotions in and of themselves, they're not bad, right? But it really is a matter of what you do. But I don't want to get ahead of our points. I also wanted to focus on the word passing. It talks about how it's a passing infatuation. But here's the thing. Believe it or not, I know Mr. Robinson and I are in our 50s, but there was a time when we weren't. I've actually been in this place. When I was young, I had my share of crushes. And here's what we want to make sure you recognize. Something that's passing, quote unquote, when you're in the middle of it and you're feeling of it, it doesn't feel like it's passing. In fact, it's hard to think of anything else. It feels like it's the center of the whole universe. But here's what time and experience teaches you, and this is going to be part of the theme today, is seeking out those who are given to you as counselors, in fact, your parents. But time kind of shows you what really is passing, and it takes time to figure that out. It takes wisdom to figure that out. And there's so many crushes, if you will, that I had when I was young that now I don't even give them a thought.
Right.
I mean, not a thought. There are literally no neurons firing in my brain at any given moment about those crushes. And yet at the time, it seemed like every neuron in my brain was firing.
Revolved around that.
That's exactly right.
And from what I understand, at least on a biological level, you can't, nor could somebody if they had, there's these things they call them functional magnetic MRIs. They can see what's lighting up in your brain real time. You can't distinguish between infatuation and love initially. Like they feel basically the same thing, same way, and look identical if you could observe it. And so with the first thing, I don't know, maybe we're getting ahead here, but it's fine. Can I say it's fine to have a crush? You're going to be infatuated with somebody.
It feels
right?
positive. Yes.
Yeah. But just kind of put the brakes on a little bit because you might not feel that way later.
Oh yeah, that's actually a biblical theme. It was revelatory to me as a young man. It was my first few years in the church. There was an older single fellow who mentioned in the context of Hebrews where it talks about the passing pleasures of sin. I hadn't really focused on that. I focused on the passing part, but he highlighted that no, it's pleasurable. No one throws themselves into a bunch of emotions and actions and stuff because they weren't pleasurable. And yeah, that's part of the danger with this, which we'll get into. It is, spending all your time thinking about that person, and that it's very pleasurable. It's firing off all the dopamine things in your brain. But that's why we want those in our lives to give us good counsel, which we'll get to. I can't help it. I did want to talk about the origin of the word crush, and this is part of the kind of the price you will have to pay from time to time for having a nerd on a podcast. It is interesting because I was wondering why was the word crush used? It seems like it has an obvious, but I had discovered there were other words, and I kind of wish some of these might come into play again. So the word crush, we know what it means. Like if you're trying to crush, some rocks or something, you're trying to turn them into something small. But there was a time when it did start being associated this way, but it wasn't the original word crush that was really doing the job. It was the word mash or masher of all things. In fact, there was a time, let's see if it says here, I'm looking this up on etymology online, where you spoke of someone like a masher. Of course, you mash potatoes. It's the same thing. But a masher in the 1500s was described as, quote, a would-be lady killer, not a murderer, but someone all the ladies...
Like a ladies' man?
Yes. One whose dress or manners are such as to impress strongly the fancy of susceptible young women. That's actually, you're getting closer to 1875 at that time. That's not the 1500s. That's 1875 in American English. So if you were a masher, then you're the kind of guy that all the ladies are getting infatuated with. And then it started to shift a bit. And in terms of crush, it says the phrase of crushing someone's emotions, that kind of sense that they're infatuated with you, but then you really care that much for them necessarily, and so their emotions are being crushed. That's kind of what's going on. And they give examples of a phrase, the Western expression, oh, he was a heart smasher among the women, which sounds violent now, right? But in 1861, there's an example from the magazine where someone was called a regular heart smasher. And there's this fellow, it's a profile of a congressman, apparently. And it says, the quote from the magazine in 1880, he had a weakness to be considered a regular masher of female hearts.
Wow.
And a very wicked young man with the fair sex generally. But apparently it wasn't true of this nice fellow. And then it says that in the late 19th century, a mash was a romantic fixation or a crush. By 1882, that's what they were calling that. And so a mash note used to be the word for a love letter. So this idea, it's always been this idea that you're crushing something. So if the origin of the word crush is, well, this is something that kind of crushes you. It kind of breaks your heart because this is not an actual relationship. So.
Interesting. I had no idea.
Did you really?
It's interesting that it came from the late 1800s as well.
Yeah, that it's been around for so long. So, okay, so the first point is, what is the definition of a crush? And I think we've kind of crushed that. I don't know how many times we're gonna lean on that.
I mean, it just teases itself.
It's a little dad jokey.
Yeah.
But anyway, so it's essentially a passing. It doesn't feel like it's passing. We're not saying that it feels like it's passing. But it's an infatuation. It's not truly something deep and profound. It's an attraction, whether someone just looks incredibly handsome or a girl that just, in your eyes, looks incredibly beautiful, or maybe they've made you laugh in a way that nobody else has or something. It's just that kind of instantaneous where there's not necessarily depth to it, but it definitely feels real. It definitely feels substantial. You have some emotions to deal with. So that was the first part I want to start with. But the second thing I wanted to make sure I encourage, especially all the more our younger people, but hey, you don't have to be younger to talk to these people, and that is talk to your parents. The second point I want to make today, other than the definition of what a crush is talk to your parents about these things. In fact, Mr. Robinson, if you don't mind, I'm going to insert Disclaimer Guy here because Disclaimer Guy has something very important to say. Go, Disclaimer Guy.
When facing large decisions, be sure to seek your parents' help, guidance, and advice, not just the advice of faceless voices on a podcast.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. And Disclaimer Guy, his statements are a little bit narrow. You might even get the sense that they're pre-recorded. That one isn't exactly right in the sense that it talks about making a big, important decision. And here you're not necessarily making an important decision, but at the same time, you sort of are. You're making a series of small decisions, and we do try to emphasize here on the program that your parents are God-given counselors to you, and you will not regret building a relationship with your parents such that you're open and talk about these things. And part of why you want to do that is because when it comes to emotions, and strong emotions are involved in having a crush, what you lack as a younger person is experience and wisdom. And that's what your parents have. They've got experience in their life. As we'll get to the next point, these feelings are really pretty normal and natural, and they have very likely run through the exact same scenarios, even if the circumstances differ, and it's worth tapping into that.
When you're a teenager, as Mr. Smith and I were teenagers at one time,
believe it or not,
your relationship with your parents can be, shall we say, complicated. But as I've become a parent, I'm just actually in awe of God's plan and how he constructs the family. And though we may not always feel this way when we're teenagers growing up, I mean, your parents are like the perfect two people to help you with this kind of thing. They've already been through what you've been through.
When it comes to feeling like you've got a crush on someone, those are very emotional kinds of things. And when emotions are growing, that's when you need the voice of wisdom and experience more than just the voice of your friends. So definitely, okay, that was the point. Talk to your parents. Third thing I'd like to say, the emotions involved with crushes are natural. The emotions themselves aren't necessarily something to feel, bad about or guilty about. It's really what you do with those. This is really the crux of it, because, something happens, you feel something. The point is, what do you do with those emotions? And here we'll start getting into some Bible verses. We want to take a look at Proverbs 30 first. Mr. Robinson, did you want to do that? You want me to do that? What would you?
The Proverbs 30.
Yeah, Proverbs
18 one?
30. Yeah, that would be great. I like this one because to me, it helps to highlight that God did design us to feel certain things. And I like Proverbs 30.
No, definitely. In fact, I just hit a button that I shouldn't have. Okay. we're back. Yes, and because I would like to, there's something about this scripture that I find, I think sometimes people walk away from it with not exactly the right understanding of it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Proverbs 30, 18 and 19. There are three things which are too wonderful for me, yes, four which I do not understand: the way of an eagle in the air, the way of a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of the sea, and the way of a man with a virgin. Another translation has maiden, and kind of the implication really is a young girl of marriageable age.
The world has taken the word virgin and has turned it into all sorts of things, but really it is talking about the way of essentially a young man with a young woman.
Yep.
Right.
And the thing I might note is if you see the other things that is compared to, the way of an eagle in the air, a serpent on a rock, the way of a ship in the midst of a sea, it's all things that are traveling on a journey. And to me, the main takeaway from this, and you might have some other things you want to add to this, Mr. Smith, is it's true. The way of a young man with a young lady is they meet each other, they get to know each other, they go through proper counseling, they get married. I mean, and it is a journey, and it is an amazing and wonderful thing, and you should experience that.
Right. It's not that God designed that to be wrong. It's very natural. There's going to be, between where you are now and the marriage that you will have, there's going to be a path there. And God designed the things that are related to that. And that definitely includes being attracted to someone. However, it's what we do with those feelings and that attraction. That's what's important. There's 3 times, we don't often read from the Song of Solomon, but there's 3 times in that book that a key phrase is said. And if God tends to say something more than once, I dare say it's something we need to pay attention to. And the woman in the Song of Solomon tells the rest of us. She's addressing, she says, the daughters of Jerusalem. But I would just say everybody could benefit from this advice. I certainly would have as a young person. In Song of Solomon 2 and verse 7, she says, I charge you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles or by the does of the field, do not stir up nor awaken love until it pleases. Until it's the right time for that. Mm-hmm. And it actually mentions that in multiple verses. Like I said, at least 3, chapter 3 and verse 5, chapter 8 and verse 4. Part of the lesson of that is, there's a time where for romance and all those kinds of things, but you do not want to unleash all of that until it is actually that time. Ecclesiastes 3 tells us, there's a season for everything. There is a time. There's a time for those kinds of emotions, and to factor them in more as a positive thing versus something to be strongly more cautious about.
Yep.
Right now in my life, if I want to take my wife out on a romantic date, that's a very positive thing. But if I'd have been 13 or 14 and I want to take someone out on a really romantic date, that's not necessarily the time for that. It's a matter of trying to of things being in their right place at their right time. I want to overdo this, but I use my wife as an example in terms of she's really she's done a great job gardening these days. And part of what she's learned is how different soils matter for different kinds of plants. And as a result, she's actually worked to try to figure out how to modify, for instance, the soil in our lawn for the grass versus the soil that she uses for her raised gardens. And when you're young, so young that you're really not even in a place where you're actually building a life, you're just learning how to build a life. You don't even have all those things in place yet. that's not the right soil to be planting seeds of romance and the rest. No, wait till later. You're still trying to develop the soil to begin with, to potentially overuse the analogy.
So there's a reason most, to our younger listeners, parents we're all troubled with the direction of the world. And one of them is just the constant in your face through entertainment, even Disney stuff, advertising, pressing of sexualization onto younger kids, younger and younger and younger.
Yes.
I saw this documentary recently, and they highlighted. I'm not going to say what it is very deliberately, but it showed these young girls in some kind of. It wasn't dance, but it might as well have been. And these little girls, and they're like 6, 7, 8, and the whole routine that they're being taught is very sexualized, and that's a real shame, because I'll tell another one of my stories. I think it was in 6th grade, and I was plenty content to be a boy, and Dad was happy with it. Not really interested in girls.
Yeah.
And that was appropriate. And I had this friend. This was 6th grade, and he constantly drew my attention to the girls, and he would comment on some feature of the girl and bring it to my attention. And I was like, come on, let's go run around the playground and play basketball and all these kind of things. But being friends with him that whole year, eventually I started noticing the girls all the time. And that wasn't good. It was early. I didn't need to be noting the girls in that way. And because it would have been, another year or two before I would have naturally paid attention to the girls anyway. And so this whole, let all those feelings slumber until the time is right. God built it into us and into our biology.
Right.
It'll start to occur at a natural time. And also it occurs at a time when we're younger and under our parents' care. We're talking about like the ideal way things are done, and that your parents can help you manage that process until you get old enough.
But before that time, it's hold off on such things. And I'm so appreciative, Mr. Robinson, that you mentioned the world in terms of media and programming and entertainment, because that had not really crossed my mind. But you're exactly right. I was thinking about it in a different context, but the lesson was the same a few days ago for some things I was thinking of writing. But media, all it really focuses on, it's virtually 100% of entertainment is what sells, what is going to make money, what is that. It's a capitalist system. People are trying to make money with the movies they sell, with the programming they put on streaming media. And as a result, for children, what has it been? Well, you make here's my thought actually this morning, was who has ever made a really fantastic series for, say, preteens, because I just had preteens in mind because of certain Disney programming, where essentially the lesson is constantly, hey, look at this troubling situation. Let's go talk to our parents and see. It's never that. It's them figuring something out on their own.
Leave it to Beaver.
Yeah, exactly. And so what do you have things encouraging young kids to put off romance and to put off those no, it's actually trying to press them at younger and younger ages because they feel like more interesting adult stories for kids. And as a result, all this has really shifted in a way. And that's why we go back to the previous point, encourage you to stay in touch with your parents and talk about these kinds of things. There's a proverb, Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 23. It's actually one of my son's favorites. We may have even mentioned it on the podcast before. In the New King James Version, in Proverbs 4 and 23, it says, "Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life." And there's a lot of other takes on that. It's funny, I kind of like the Good News Translation, even though it's a little more tepid, where it says, "Be careful how you think. Your life is shaped by your thoughts." I like that, but it's not a very direct translation. I miss the poetry, and in particular in this case, especially when it's issues of the heart involved, there are a lot of good translations. The NIV in this case is not terrible. We don't recommend it in general, but it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And I think that's a really great way to put it.
So my secondary, it's actually the third, my tertiary translation that I like, that's for that purposes. You're just looking for kind of a summary of it. Very similar to the NIV, but with one difference. It says, "Guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life.
That's right. And that's what we're talking about here, because you're talking about matters of the heart, your affections. And, when you're younger, this all the more, it's a time to truly protect that, because next thing you know, your emotions are leading you from place to place, and those haven't even been fully developed yet. They haven't been given the time. You can feel intense anger and even hatred even a baby can feel some of those things. But what that baby hasn't had the opportunity is time to mature and let experience teach them when to wield such intense feelings versus when to set them on the shelf and not act on them. And this passage, this proverb encourages you, no, you be careful with your heart. You manage it. You don't let it rule you, because it is going to be a major influencer on your mind and on your actions, on really the rest of your life.
Well, who you select to be your spouse is, other than, of course, choosing to counsel and be baptized and commit to that relationship with God as you grow up. Other than that, name something to me that's a more important decision that you'll make than other than your spouse. It's going to impact the rest of your life. And that's a little bit what the scripture's saying, in a sense.
Yes.
Well, at least there's an implication of that. So
no, I think it is connected.
I don't want to get dark, but a great way to be much older and kind of upset and bitter with how your life went could be traced back to a rash decision you made in your teens.
Oh boy, I do agree with that. I try to be artful about it, but for a long time I've tried to say that, even, in fact, I think I came up with it in my 30s for some reason, but it was a sermonette, and I was trying to highlight to younger people in the sermonette that here I am in my 30s, and I am working hard to chop down oak trees that I planted back in my teens, and they were an acorn when I was a teen, and I wish I could travel back in time and slap my young self in the face and say, dude, do not plant that acorn, man. You don't understand how much time and energy and calories you're going to have to burn trying to chop down this oak tree, and how much better it would have been to not plant the acorn in the first place. And so it is saying this kind of thing when it comes to crushes. You feel Twitter-pated. That's a good old word, Twitter-pated. Does anybody say that anymore, Mr. Robinson?
I've never even heard that word.
Really? Well, congratulations. You got a new word. So you're feeling Twitter-pated, butterflies in your stomach. Yeah. And
I still haven't heard that word.
But regardless, this is not a time to just abandon yourself to those feelings, because they really are just feelings and emotions, and they're relatively shallow and unfounded.
As in some of my research uncovered, you actually have to be careful. Because somebody could take advantage of you. Again, just to do our part to make you aware of there is a risky side to this. You find somebody you're strongly attracted to, you kind of have this idealized version of them in your mind. You're ignoring potential red flags. Possibly, we're talking about a worst case scenario here, and the other person, especially if they're older than you, could be well aware of that and really take advantage of you because you're not seeing things clearly.
Right. You're right. And plus, not only does it feel really good to kind of allow yourself to roll around in the emotions of a crush, frankly, if you're a person and someone has a crush on you, that's pretty gratifying to you. It makes you feel like you're really something kind of special. And next thing you know, you could even be feeding that, not because you actually care about the other person, but because you're enjoying the fact that someone is so caught up in you, and let alone worse versions of that. Let me summarize what we've said so far, because we're on our last 2 points. The first thing we did was we talked about what a crush is, focusing on the fact that it's kind of a passing infatuation. Secondly, we tried to encourage you, talk to your parents. God has given you adults in your life, including even your minister, but don't be embarrassed about building a relationship with your parents such that you go to them with things like this. In fact, I would say, if you're not willing to talk to your parents at all, if it just seems utterly unthinkable, not awkward, it can feel awkward, but unthinkable, then that could be a red flag about that. Why wouldn't you want their advice about something? The third thing was that emotions involved in crushes are natural emotions. It's not that having emotion is bad. It's what you do with those. That's really the important thing. And that leads to the fourth point that I wanted to say, which was when feelings involved with a crush happen to arise in your life, One way to think about that is to consider it an opportunity. This is an opportunity to develop and practice habits that will be far more important in the future than you might think. That is, let me repeat that because I kind of made it long unnecessarily. But whenever these kinds of feelings arise, this kind of sense of an infatuation with a particular person, this is an opportunity for you to develop and practice habits that will be far more important in your future than you might think. And this is where I want to credit actually Mr. Sandor's essay that he turned in and I accidentally neglected, because he actually made this point really well, and I appreciate that he did. If these feelings are natural and they show up, okay, so they're there. What you do with them is actually training in a great way for your future. Because think about it. One of the bases of attraction is just physical appearance, right? That boy is so cute, or oh, that girl, she's the cutest girl I've ever seen. Well, in fact, when it comes to your kind of stereotypical crushes, like on Hollywood stars or particular singers, clearly that is super shallow because you don't even know that person. Not
Right.
really. You know what their PR department maybe lets you know about them, but that's really about it. But those kind of infatuations, they're especially shallow. But when you're feeling them, it's an opportunity to practice. Okay, well, what do I do with these things? And learning to examine yourself, not getting caught up in your feelings, but learning to step away from them a bit and actually examine them. Why am I feeling this way? What is it that's stirring these thoughts? Because if you're practicing self-examination, that is one of the most foundational practices of Christian living, that as a Christian, you'll be engaging in the rest of your life, not just being in the moment like everyone always tells you to do, but learning to step aside from the moment and actually think about it and ask yourself, why am I feeling this way?
So how do you feel about me phrasing it this way? As you get older, you get a little more mature. And to me, this is kind of a sign of leveling up, if you will, if I can put it that way.
I love leveling up.
It's like now you're a teen. You're not a little kid anymore. You make a lot more of your own decisions. Now you've gone through the process where you're now interested in the opposite sex. But then also, if you think about it, so let's say you're 15 and and maybe it even catches you by surprise. There's just something, boy or girl, and you're suddenly like, wow, that you form a crush on them. You have a strong feeling towards them. You're infatuated with them. Well, if you're 15, in 3 years, you're going to be considered an adult by the state. Even in a few more years, there's an increased probability that perhaps you've moved out on your own. And the point is, you are really entering a phase of your life where you're going to make all the decisions for yourself. And so it's kind of a blessing in a way to get something like this. It allows you, while you still have your parents' guidance, to start practicing self-control, because you are going to need it when you're 18, 19, 20. I'll tell one of my shame stories. My kids were quite amused by this. Growing up in the church, we were very careful about sugar. And I don't think I'd ever had a Coca-Cola until I was like over 18. Now, I've had some Dr. Pepper, so you and I bond on the Dr. Pepper. But my family moved out of state. I stayed behind for about a year, and I had my own apartment, and I was 18. And now suddenly food is all my responsibility. So there was a lot of Burger King there. This was quite for $2, I think I could get a decent burger and French fries. I forget what all it was. But anyway, here's the point. More than a couple of times, I got a box of the Little Debbie donuts, chocolate covered, the smaller ones, and a bag of Fritos, chili cheese Fritos.
Oh man.
And I ate the whole thing. I ate the chili cheese Fritos first, and then I ate the donuts. And because part of it was I now had the freedom to eat whatever I wanted, and that was the kind of thing that we did not eat growing up, and it was delicious. But not a great long-term strategy. But my hopefully humorous story is to point out there's one day you're going to wake up and all the decisions are yours. Now, you can still call upon your parents and people older than you, people you trust, people you feel like have experience that you would like to, but you're this is a great time. I loved Mr. Sandor's point. I thought it was a very good point, which was, this is a great chance to start practicing having some self-control over especially your emotions.
Right. And the way you put it a while ago about how, when you're 15, you have the chance to practice this while still in your parents' home, while they're ready and they're available. As I moved out, my parents were still there, but I'd have to call, right? I'd have to take the time and effort to reach out. They weren't there every day. And then, I don't mean to be morbid, but then they died, right?
Mm-hmm,
And I don't have them anymore.
Right.
But when you're 15, yeah, see this as an opportunity to think, okay, I'm feeling these things. This is my opportunity to practice on dealing with it right. And when we say it's an investment in terms of future situations, well, think about that. Like the point I was trying to make a while ago, a lot of crushes, they're just attractive. An attractive Hollywood star, the attractive pop singer, or the attractive guy you saw in school, or the attractive gal, in your congregation maybe, or something. Well, that's really relatively shallow. But the thing is, the world is going to be filled with attractive people the rest of your life, including after you get married. You might truly believe your wife or your husband is the most beautiful or the most handsome man in the world. And I will say, that's if you do marriage right, so many things get added to that bond, more than just how attractive that person is. But what it doesn't stop is other attractive people showing up in your life. If what got you infatuated with that boy or that girl was how funny the person was, man, you're going to run into funny people and attractive people in your workplace, or in some other environment. And so many broken marriages happen when someone didn't stop that. The things that might infatuate them start to make that other person feel like a soulmate, or that person is so much nicer to me than my spouse is when I've burnt the toast, or whatever the case is. These are moments for you to practice not allowing your emotion to dictate to you, not really just what your actions are, but even what is right and wrong. And when you hear some of these stories, I was reflecting on one of them that I don't want to mention the actual person's name. It's a famous person, but actually, you can go back to the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp one. If you actually go back to that old podcast that we did, we talk about some of those things there, where someone is talking about their real connection with this other person. But if they were actually guided by the things they should be guided by, they would treat that marriage with such respect and awe that they would never even allow themselves to follow that path of that initial attraction. Well, you know what? When you're young and you're feeling those kind of attractions, this is the time to practice.
Yep.
So practice it when you're 15, so that when you're 45, you've built those muscles, choosing
right.
to do the right thing with your emotions.
Man, if there's one thing I've learned as I've aged, it's good habits formed early serve you well later in your life and help you avoid trouble. There's a term for which I would say I actually had this experience in a sense. There's a term called a work spouse. And
yes,
you've heard that. And so the print shop I worked for a long time was a mix of men and women, as many places are. And there was a woman, I can't remember what our ages were. Our ages were similar. But I worked with her 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. And, after 3 or 4 years, you get to know the people really well. And I realized, boy, you really have to kind of be careful and guard yourself with that, because you know them so well, because you spend a lot of time around them.
Right.
And so to your point, starting when you're younger to practice self-control and putting the appropriate godly boundaries in, like it doesn't go away. It was kind of what you're saying. You'll end up in a work situation that you don't have any control over, in terms of who's working there, and you might find yourself working closely with a woman, which you didn't even know or anticipate.
Right.
And you have to be on guard.
Absolutely. So look at these, don't feel guilty that you feel some things, right? But then don't run away with them. Rather, use it as an opportunity to practice, because emotions, unless I think actually Mr. Sandor says something like this in the essay he submitted, unless you're actually a Vulcan, for those who are Star Trek nerds.
He did say that.
Yeah, you're going to have these things to wrestle with your whole life. So start
and even
now.
Then, Spock was half human, and always
that's right.
He always grappled with the emotional human side.
The nerd needle is really starting to move on the dial there. Okay, so we have a hope of finishing this in an hour, less than an hour. Going to use this to move on to the last point that I wanted to bring up for this, which was, okay, that's fine. You guys are saying, hey, okay, don't let your emotions run away with you. Talk to your parents. Make sure they give you perspective, because perspective is really what is needed in cases like this. Well, then what do I do? All that seems a little more don't do this or don't do that. What do I do? Well, the last point I want to make is, what should you do? You should focus on the priorities that belong to the age of development you're in right now. And actually, if I can throw the older side of our audience in this at this point, the young adults out there, you really might be in a place where it's time to date and find a spouse, try to actually, well, again, then these things still apply. You don't want to just rush ahead on your emotions based only on shallow things, but at the same time, it doesn't mean you can't act on them in some other way. You find someone attractive, well, then get to know them and dive a little deeper, right? And actually just don't allow yourself to have those rose-colored glasses on where you just don't see, where it really is infatuation instead of a mature, legitimate interest. But for our younger listeners, again, take your cues from your parents, but there are things that you should be focusing on in various stages of your life. And when you're, say, 15, finding the romance of your life is not one of those things. You've got so many more important things to develop in your life. And I would encourage you, there's an article in an old Tomorrow's World. I say old, it's only 2020. But in the July-August 2020 Tomorrow's World, Mr. Jonathan McNair wrote a really helpful article about dating. It was called Should We Kiss Dating Hello? It was kind of a play on the book, Kissing Dating Goodbye or whatever, by the fellow who, frankly, doesn't even consider himself a Christian anymore and has left
among other things.
Among other things, that's right. So he actually, if you read Mr. Jonathan McNair's article, it's the feature that we call Tomorrow's Families Today. That's right. That's what we call that feature in the magazine.
Yeah,
and it's written to parents to give them advice on helping their children learn about dating and dealing with the opposite sex. But it's very good. I there's no reason you can't read it too, right? You read the things he says there, because what he talks about is trying to address the stage where you are, behaving with the opposite sex, making choices, growing into dating, if you will, in a way that's in line with the stage of development you are currently in. And I would say read that for something that's kind of focused in terms of potential romance and those kinds of things, to give you a mindset that, okay, when it comes to dealing with other people, what am I trying to learn at this stage? What is it I'm actually trying to do? And so that you don't take for granted that you've already developed enough for those things that, frankly, are really better to come later in your life.
I don't have anything to add to that. Great job. Great job, Mr. Smith.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Okay, well, we did want to conclude with, I keep mentioning Mr. Sandor's wonderful essay that I just completely lost sight of.
It was so good. It got lost in the bin heap.
Yeah. We'll do our best to edit that. And so I know, unless there's anything else we want to say, we wanted to conclude with, frankly, something he wrote.
Yes.
There.
That sounds good.
Want to conclude that? All right, we'll do that. Mr. Sandor wrote the following. This should show up in the essay that we will eventually publish one day on the
Watch
Living
for it in
Youth
your
website.
LCN.
Watch for it. Mr. Sandor says, so when you have a crush as a teenager, view it as an opportunity to grow in self-control. The fact that you are interested in someone romantically is not always a bad thing. It's just a matter of timing, wisdom, and self-control. That time of dating and acting with wisdom on certain emotions will come, but the lessons of self-control that you can learn from how you handle the emotions of crushes that occur too soon can also help you build the self-control you need to have a successful marriage later. And that's Mr. Sandor.
Excellent advice.
Excellent advice. Do you think we crushed it, Mr. Robinson?
Only our audience can determine that.
Be kind in the emails. Be kind.
Exactly. Thank you for not commenting, everybody.